The Civil War is over. 750,000 people have died. The South is in ruins. This is Reconstruction. Welcome to Lessons in Humanities. For PowerPoints, Google Slides, lesson plans, primary source activities, and more, visit the Lessons in Humanities store. The link to the store is in the description below. So after the Civil War, the South was destroyed. Cities like Atlanta were ruined, railroads were uplifted, the roads were gone, and much, much more. The antebellum way of life would not return. The South and the whole United States needed to be fixed. It needed to be reconstructed. And that's where we get the word Reconstruction. It lasted from 1863 to 1877. And it was the idea of bringing the South back into the Union and giving African Americans citizenship and the right to vote. Now, there were widespread discussions on what citizenship actually meant. And there were people like the radical Republicans and the Freedmen who were pushing the United States to live up to the words from the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and that all people have unalienable rights. Now, the presidents during this time period included 4 presidents. So obviously we have Abraham Lincoln. He was a president during the Civil War, and he would actually start the first Reconstruction plan. And then he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. The vice president, Andrew Johnson, would become the next president, and he would have his own plan. But he was very widely opposed by Congress, and there would be a new plan after him. And then Ulysses S. Grant, who was a great hero from the Civil War, would take over the last part of Reconstruction. And then when Rutherford B. Hayes became the president, Reconstruction would be finished forever. Now, let's talk about Lincoln's presidential Reconstruction, wartime construction, but either word is fine. So this is from 1863 to 1865. So by the mid-1863, the Union had taken over some regions in the South, and it was clear the North was going to win the war. So in December, Lincoln started his Reconstruction plan. His plan would be known as the 10% plan. And that's because 10% people would have to show their loyalty to the Union. So many people felt Lincoln's plan was too lenient. They saw the South as traitors, and they thought they should be punished. So let's talk about the 10% plan. So it's also called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. It was proposed on December 8th, 1863, when the war was still going on. Now, this is after the Union had stopped Robert E. Lee from bringing the war to the North during the Battle of Gettysburg. And the Union had taken control of the South, so it became clear that the North was going to win. Now, Lincoln didn't consult Congress when he created this plan. And he said that when there was 10% of the voting population from 1860 election had taken an oath of loyalty to the United States and established a government, it would be reinstated to the Union. This was basically replacing the majority rule with a type of loyalty rule in the South. Now, Lincoln wanted to pardon all civilian Confederate officers, but not the highest ranking officers. In 1864, 3 states created Unionist governments, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee, and many people call these states the Lincoln governments. Now, the radical Republicans were angry. They thought it was too lenient and felt Southern aristocracy would reinstate slavery. So people generally and naturally would oppose this. Congress was angry at Lincoln's plan. And 2 senators, Ohio Republican named Senator Benjamin Wade and a Maryland Republican Congressman Henry Davis, they proposed the Wade-Davis bill. Now, the majority of the state would have to take, this was their idea, was that the majority of the state would have to take the loyalty oath in order to be reinstated to the Union. And there were wanted more protections for the freedmen. Now, President Lincoln pocket vetoed this bill. And what does that mean? That means basically he ignored it until it just was forgotten. So it never came into existence. And of course, as we all know, 5 days after the Confederacy surrendered in the Civil War, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor, assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. So they were at Ford's Theater watching Our American Cousin. And they would need a new president. And of course, Lincoln couldn't fulfill his Reconstruction plan. And if he could, maybe Reconstruction would have went more smoothly. But we have a new president, and it's Andrew Johnson. 1 month after Lincoln was killed, Jefferson Davis, and he was the president of the Confederacy of the South, he was arrested. Now, the Union was very lenient on Jefferson Davis. He was only in prison for 2 years. After that, he traveled abroad for a couple of years, and when he came back, he couldn't find any work, and he died very poor. But he never actually took the oath to the United States. Now, on the other hand, the great Confederate General Robert E. Lee was pardoned. And he started a college, and he did take the oath, but they didn't know about it when he was alive. They found it in writing after he had died. This was the 13th Amendment, the most famous amendment in the bill, the United States, it's the Constitution. It was passed by Congress on January 31st, and this is 1865, and it's before Lincoln had died. Now, it was ratified after Lincoln had passed away on December 6th, 1865, and it abolished slavery, except for as a punishment for a crime. So it goes like this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, another important part of the Reconstruction period was the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, this was actually initiated by Abraham Lincoln, and it was only intended to last for 1 year, but it lasts from 1865 to 1872. Now, this was to help freedmen, so this is ex-slaves in the South. It was to provide them shelter, provide supplies, help freedmen find their lost loved ones, to educate freedmen, and to be legal advocates for them as well. President Andrew Johnson would be against this. He said it went against states' rights. Northern Democrats said it made African Americans in the South too lazy. So this did have some pushback, the Freedmen Bureau. Now, an important thing to consider during this time period is what we call, our types of people at this time period were called the Carpetbaggers and Scalawags. Carpetbaggers was a slanderous name given by Southerners describing Northerners who traveled to the South to promote Republican politics, rights of blacks to vote and hold office, or just to take advantage of business opportunities. Southerners often called officers from the Freedmen Bureau Carpetbaggers. Now, Scalawags, another name from this time period, these were Southerners who supported the Reconstruction policies. So, for example, somebody in the South, many people in the South did not like the Reconstruction policies. So a scalawag was somebody who supported the Union or the North or these policies that was kind of restricting the freedoms of the Southerners. Now, one thing that was very important for the freedmen is land. So freed families wanted land as it could provide food for their families and a way of living. Now, at the end of the war, William Tecumseh Sherman, who was responsible for the March to the Sea, which really destroyed the South, he issued what was called the Special Field Order Number 15 at the end of the war. Now he set aside land in Georgia and South Carolina for freed people. Sherman, he did not have the authority to do this, and President Johnson would reverse it. And I think you see continuity, or something that keeps happening here, is Johnson is pushing back against these policies to reconstruct the South. Another name for this special field order number 15 is called 40 acres and a mule. So basically, free families would be given 40 acres of land and a mule to help work the land. The Freedmen's Bureau worked to redistribute. This is another land policy. The Freedmen's Bureau, which worked to redistribute land to the enslaved, the primarily enslaved. By 1866, the land was given back to ex-Confederates. So you can see here these early plans to try to give the freedmen land were not working. In fact, after this, Freedmen Bureau agents met with black leaders and encouraged them to go back to work with their former enslavers, but not free labor, but as wage labor. So this brings us to Johnson's presidential reconstruction from 1865 to 1867. And I've already mentioned a couple areas where he was a little bit restrictive on some of these movements that were trying to bring change to the South. And basically, Abraham Lincoln was unable to fulfill his Reconstruction plan, obviously because he was assassinated. And Vice President Andrew Johnson would become president. And like Lincoln, he believed the Southern states never had the right to secede, which means leave the Union. He was a Southern Democrat, and he believed in states' rights. And he was also a constitutional constructionist, which means you follow the Constitution to the T. He was also anti-aristocrat, the aristocracy in the South he didn't like. And he was also an unapologetic racist. So when Johnson took office, there were three types of congressmen that were going to kind of either support him or go against him. And one were the radical Republicans, and they wanted a stronger federal rule in the South and protect black people's rights. The moderate Republicans wanted to give blacks more nominal power, but not as much as the radical Republicans. And then you have the Northern Democrats who wanted unconditional restoration of the South and did not want to allow blacks to vote. It should be noted that while some Republicans wanted to give blacks the right to vote for moral reasons, there was also the incentive to get more power, political power, so they get the blacks to vote and give them, and they would probably vote for Republicans. Okay, so here is his presidential reconstruction. Sometimes in history books they just call it presidential construction, but I'm calling it Johnson's construction plan. So Johnson wanted a quick restoration. He spoke of hanging Confederates. He was very against these elites. But when he came to power, he was very lenient on them. He pardoned Southerners who were involved in the Civil War, and he did not include this did not include landowners with more than $20,000 in property. They, in fact, needed to seek a pardon directly from President Johnson, and he would give a lot of pardons. In the new constitutions, they must repudiate slavery, succession, and their state debts. And he named the provisional governors in Confederate states to establish state governments. So Johnson really hoped that a new Southern class would replace the wealthy plantation owners, but that's not exactly what would happen. Now, here are the effects of Johnson's plan. Certain leading Confederates were indeed disenfranchised, but new constitutions did not meet the specified requirements. And pardoned planter aristocrats were brought back to political power to control state organizations and reestablish antebellum power relationships. So Johnson pardoned 13,500 special pardons. This would allow some Southern states to pass black codes, which virtually reestablished de facto slavery. And Republicans were furious about this because the planter elites were back in power. And as I mentioned, there's the Black Codes. So this was to regulate the behaviors of freedmen. It guaranteed stable labor supply. The South imposed social and economic controls on the freedmen, and it limited mobility, it criminalized pleasure, and it locked some blacks into an exploitive farming. And as people said back in the 1860s and 1870s, this was slavery by another name. So in a sense, it wasn't restored like it was before, but in a sense, the antebellum South was restored. Now, this is an important point. With Johnson's weak Reconstruction plan and failures after him, the elites in the South were able to recreate a similar situation in the South as was before the war. Obviously not as bad, but one has to consider it would be around 100 years before the Civil Rights Movement. I'll give you an example. So in Mississippi, they passed these vagrancy laws. Freedmen had to carry papers proving they were employed. Now, if they didn't show these papers, they were arrested or fined. If they couldn't pay off the fine, the sheriff would hire them out for work without pay. Sounds very much like slavery. So, Black Codes, Black Codes and violence towards African Americans in the South led Republicans in Congress to call for a more dramatic Reconstruction. So, President Johnson, he was announcing that the South had been restored. But the Congress Republicans did not believe that, and obviously that's not what was happening with the Black Codes and the elites coming back into power. So the Republicans in Congress responded with lots of legislation aimed at helping freedmen and fixing relationships between the North and the South. Some Republican members in Congress wanted blacks to vote in the South for racial equality, right? And like I said before, and some wanted to do it because the Republicans wanted more power. Now, there's one famous radical Republican that you should remember, and his name is Thaddeus Stevens. So he was very, very devout and very ambitious and focused on helping the freedmen in the South. So this brings us to the next type of Reconstruction, which is called Congressional Reconstruction or Radical Reconstruction. So presidential Reconstruction shifted to this new one, Congressional Reconstruction. And they created a joint committee on Reconstruction. Now, it started, and this happened a little bit before, with what was called the Civil Rights Act in 1866. Now, this was a response to the Black Codes. It was an attempt to constitutionally define all people born in the United States as a citizen. Now, this did not include Native Americans. President Johnson vetoed the bill, but Congress overrode the veto and the Civil Rights Act became a law. Now, this is the first time in American history when Congress was able to override a bill or a veto. So I'll just mention real quick why Johnson vetoed it. His argument was that 11 of the 13 states were not represented in Congress, and he also said it discriminated against white people. Now this is so that's his reasoning. And this experience encouraged moderate and radical Republicans to propose a new amendment. And this new amendment is the 14th Amendment. 13th and 14th Amendments are very important for the Reconstruction period. Now, I should mention that in the 1866 midterm election, it gave more radical Republicans a lot more power, and they're going to continually go against Johnson. It's going to be a war between Congress and the President Johnson. And with this power, Congress was veto-proof. They could override it, just like they did with the Civil Rights Act. And so they proposed the 14th Amendment, which overturned the Dred Scott decision. Now, if you remember, the Dred Scott decision was before the Civil War, and it was determined that Dred Scott, who had lived in the North for a while, could never be a citizen, and therefore any African American a citizen of the United States. So this overturned it. And it says something like this: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states wherein they reside. So it ensured that state laws could not discriminate against particular groups. President Johnson opposed the passage of the 14th Amendment, but again, he didn't have any power. The radical Republicans had too much power in Congress, so he could not veto it. And southern states would be punished for denying the right to give these rights to blacks in the South. Okay, so more about the Reconstruction, the Congressional Reconstruction Plan. They call it the Reconstruction Act. Now, it dissolved state governments in the South. So basically, it's redoing everything that was done before. It divided the South into 5 military districts, and states had to ratify the 13th and the 14th Amendments. And the states had to also write new constitutions, giving blacks the rights and to abolish the black codes. Now, it should be noted that Tennessee was not included because they had ratified the 13th and 14th Amendment. And here's the map if you see it. Here's the different time zones, the different districts, led by the military. District 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But Tennessee, since they ratified it, they were reinstated to the Union. Now we have the Tenure of Office Act. Now, this was part of the Reconstruction Act, and you'll see why I'm putting this slide in here. It basically said that the president could not remove any government officials without the Senate's consent if the position originally required Senate approval. And then it also includes the Command of Army Act. President must issue all Reconstruction orders through the commander of the military. Now, this is the important point. President Johnson would dismiss somebody by the name of Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, which violated the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson would also replace generals who were sympathetic to the radical Republicans, which violated the Command of Army Act. So that's going to lead to his impeachment. So he was impeached for obstructing Congressional Reconstruction. So he violated the Tenure of Office Act and the Command of Army Act, which I just showed you on the prior slide. The House voted to impeach Johnson, but the Senate acquitted him. And it should be mentioned that this was the first time in American history that a president was impeached. Only 2 other presidents have been impeached. The other 2 include Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, who was impeached twice. And Richard Nixon was never impeached. He resigned. So this brings us to the election of 1868. So Ulysses S. Grant, he's a Republican, and he was going against somebody named Horatio Samar, and he was a Democrat. So Ulysses S. Grant, he was the great general for the Union during the Civil War, and Grant was promised to protect the new status quo. His slogan was, "Let us have peace." And Horatio, he promised to repeal Reconstruction. He wanted to stop it. Now, Ulysses S. Grant won the election, and one reason he won is because Southern blacks would vote for him. And his presidency would be plagued with lots of scandals. So we'll talk a little bit about his presidency. So like I said, there's lots of scandals during his presidency. It wasn't necessarily he was corrupt, but some of the people in his administration were corrupt, or they did some corrupt things, and that made him and his presidency look corrupt. Sometimes he defended some of these people, right? But instead of selecting trustworthy politicians for his cabinet, Grant chose old associates that he had that he was friends with, and they had little understanding of politics and kind of a weak sense of civilian ethics. Some examples of these scandals include Black Friday gold panic. It was in 1869. There were two Wall Street manipulators. One was named Jay Gould, and another one was James Fisk. They were able to get access to Grant and manipulate the gold market. There's another one called the Whiskey Ring. It happened in 1875, where whiskey distillers in the Midwest made deals with local government agents to not pay taxes and to pay them money, part of their profits. So again, that's not what Ulysses S. Grant did, but people in his administration did. But during his administration, the 15th Amendment was passed, which gave blacks the right to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, and this banned discrimination in public accommodations. He also fought against terror in the South, like the KKK. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed. It went from Iowa to California, so that's going to continue the movement to the West. Congress established a de facto gold standard that reduced the number of greenbacks. Under Lincoln's administration and during the war, he printed greenbacks that were not backed by gold. It was the first time in American history, but Lincoln didn't really want to do that, but he needed to do that because of the war. And, at this time, really in all American history, there's this hard money and soft money debate. Does money need to be backed by gold or silver? The banks want hard money. The farmers want soft money because they can print more and increase their prices. But Grant signed a Public Credit Act, and it said bond investors would be paid in gold, and some greenbacks would be recalled back. Not all, just some. There's also the Panic of 1873, which is going to take place during his presidency, and this is important, not for the fact that it's a Great Depression, not the Great Depression, but a very painful depression. But this is going to shift the focus from Reconstruction to the economy. And Grant tried to make peace with some of the Native American tribes in the South, but there was the Great Sioux War of 1876. And this is when the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne fought the United States. And more famously, part of that war included Custer's last stand when he was massacred by Crazy Horse and his people. So this is a later stage of the Reconstruction, and now we have Grant in office. In 1860, there was only 5 states in the North that allowed blacks to vote. So, and that's right before the Civil War, and that's in the North. After 1867, blacks began to win elections throughout the South. And they were active in revising state constitutions, helped establish public school systems, helped open mental asylums, hospitals, orphanages, and prisons for whites and blacks, and it was often segregated. Now, the South went from white, pro-slavery Democrat stronghold to Republican states with blacks in power. Now, 2,000 blacks would hold office during Reconstruction. They served at every level of government. Many of the office holders were born free, or they gained their freedom during the Civil War. Many were wealthy and educated. But it would only last till the end of Reconstruction, when the Democrats took control and only few blacks would remain in office. They would not re-enter the political arena until the mid-1900s. And if you look in this picture here, this is Hiram Revels, and he was the first African American to serve in Congress. He was a senator from Mississippi from 1870 to 1871. All right, so the 15th Amendment. So this was ratified in 1870 during the Grant administration, and it gave freedmen the right to vote. So as it says here, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, this is going to infuriate women because they want the right to vote as well. I shouldn't say all women, but women suffragists at this time. And women would not get the right to vote until 1919. So that brings us to women during the Reconstruction period. So women's rights movement started before the Civil War. And during the Civil War, they stopped or they were slowed down, and they reignited after the Civil War. Now we have the American Equal Rights Association, AERA. It was formed after I'm not exactly sure when. I guess that would be after the Civil War. Now the National Women's Rights Convention and the Anti-Slavery Society, they joined to create the AERA. So that would make sense. It would be after the Civil War. Lucretia Mott was the president of AERA, and she was very prominent in the women's rights movement before the Civil War. In fact, I think I just had a picture there. That's her right there, Lucretia Mott. Now, they argued for universal suffrage, not just African American suffrage. Now, this brought a lot of controversy. Some advocates argued for universal suffrage before black suffrage. They say if we're going to give African Americans the right to vote, why wait and not give women the right to vote? But there was another argument, and this is one that even Frederick Douglass argued, was that yes, everybody needs the right to vote, but it doesn't have to be at the same time because it's life or death in the South and that's why it was so important for blacks to get the right to vote. And it should be mentioned that a lot of these movements were in the North. Now, two very famous people in the women's rights movement, in addition to Lucretia Mott, is Susan B. Anthony. So here, again, this is Lucretia Mott. And then here we have Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are two of the most recognized leaders in the women's rights movement, and they met before the Civil War. Stanton was responsible for organizing the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which was the first women's rights movement. And it was at that convention that she suggested that women should have the right to vote. And people at the convention at that time thought she was going too far. But then after that convention, it became a very important focus point in the women's rights movement. Now, Anthony and Stanton, they felt the AERA was only concentrated on black suffrage and not universal suffrage. Now, universal suffrage means everybody, not just black people or white people or everybody. Women, black, white, everybody could vote. So that made them angry, right? The 15th Amendment made them angry. And they also argued a little bit later, that the Constitution already gave women the right to vote. So they read it and they interpreted it in a way that it doesn't say that women don't have the right to vote. So they told women to go vote. And between 1868 and 1872, 700 women actually went out and voted. And Anthony, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for this, but she was later acquitted. And in 1875, the Supreme Court said women had citizenship, but they did not have the right to vote. So it's going to be a long ways. It's going to be in 1919 when they get the right to vote. Now, white terror in the South is going to be a major issue. So racial violence in the South. So the South had been built on slavery, and many white Southerners refused to accept black free labor after the Civil War. So in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan was formed, and they terrorized blacks and Republicans at voting polls or workplaces or homes. And there were other white terror groups like the Night Riders, the Bushwhackers, the Knights of White Camellia, White Brotherhood, and more. And some of them even operated at night when it was dark. There was also riots against black political authority, and there's many examples of violence towards blacks during this period. For example, in 1866 in New Orleans, there was the New Orleans Massacre, and blacks were protesting against the black codes, and they were attacked by a mob, and 38 of them were killed. Between 1870 and 1871, the federal government passed the Enforcement Acts. This was underneath the Grant administration, and they made it illegal to deny blacks their civil rights. And this was an attempt to stop the KKK from continuing their violence, but the KKK would continue to be violent. White Southerners argue that the white violence that was in the newspapers and that has been reported was exaggerated, or that some of it was fabricated. Nonetheless, white terrorism ended federal involvement in Reconstruction and replaced it with racial repression. Now, let's talk about the economy. So the war destroyed and then it transformed the American economy. So just like before the war, this is during the war. So in the North, they had industry, infrastructure, they had financial systems. During the war, they raised tariffs. They passed the first national income tax. They created the first fiat currency, the greenbacks. And they increased business during the war, but they also had inflation. So with the more money in circulation, it did actually do a little bit of a boom in the North. Now the South during the war, before the war, they were quite wealthy because of cotton, and it was the slave labor that made them wealthy. But they were cut off from selling the cotton during the war, because during the war, the North blockaded the ports and they couldn't sell the cotton. They also could not import other supplies and foods or guns because they were basically surrounded during the Civil War from the Mississippi River all the way to the Atlantic Ocean and some of the major ports. And it was agricultural society, but they did have some industry, but not like the North. Now after the war, there was some economic developments in the South during the Reconstruction period, but the South was in ruins after the war, and white planters lost most of their wealth. Cotton was still important, but there was more competition in the world. And also Lord's plantations, they turned into small plots of land, and there would be sharecroppers on that land. It moved from slave labor to free labor. But of course, there was this extra legal violence to keep blacks bounded by labor. And there was deep poverty throughout the South, and it would really last until the 1930s. Now, I was talking about sharecroppers. Sharecroppers were poor black and white farmers who earned a living from land owned by somebody else. So they worked independently, growing cotton or tobacco or rice, sugar and other type of cash crops. And landowners provided them with the land, some housing, some tools, some seed, and possibly a mule. And then merchants would provide them with other supplies they needed, but they would do it on credit. So at harvest time, the sharecroppers received a certain percentage of their output, but they had to use the other money to pay back their debt to the merchant. Now, this was widespread in the South during the Reconstruction period. And as I mentioned before, the Lord's plantations, they had been divided into smaller plots of land. And this would last into the mid-1900s. In fact, if you look at this photo, this is from 1941. Now, the end of Reconstruction. So it's going to end in 1877. This is after, right at the end or after Grant's administration. So, when the North abandoned the cause for blacks in the South and Democrats took political control of the South, that's when Reconstruction was closer and closer to ending. And there's going to be this deeper focus on the economy, especially after the Panic of 1873, which was a depression. People are going to lose interest in working on construction. The only thing that kept Reconstruction going was the military presence in the South. But there wasn't enough officials in the South to enforce the 14th Amendment. And it's going to be the election of 1876 and the resulting Compromise of 1877, which is going to end Reconstruction. But first, let's talk about how they got more power in the South, the Democrats, right? Because Democrats are going to try to bring it back to antebellum or pre-Civil War South. So there was these Democrats that were called Redeemers. And they were Democrats who distanced themselves from pro-slavery Democrats. They accepted that slavery was over. And the Redeemers were just Democrats that concentrated on business and economics and trade rather than slavery issues. They won support in the South for promising local rule by white Democrats, not white Republicans or blacks. And this helped pave the way for the Democrats to control or to recontrol the South. And by 1871, Redeemers had control of Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia, and they continued to have more and more control. Now, there was also the Panic of 1873. So this was the Depression, the Great Depression, until 1929 when that became the Great Depression. But wages plummeted. Debt trapped workers in endless cycles of poverty. Now, this helped Democrats gain control during the midterm elections of 1874. And this would make it difficult to continue Reconstruction with the Democrats in control. And it also made the focus on the economy, not the Reconstruction. So you can see what's happening here. They're going to abandon Reconstruction. They're going to concentrate on the economy. But this is what the real final ending to the Reconstruction. We have an election in 1876 it's Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and he's going against Samuel J. Tilden, a Democrat. And it's the most disputed election in American history. So it can be compared to the corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Tilden won 19 more electoral votes, but 20 electoral votes from 4 states were disputed. So and with those 20 disputed votes, it would turn the other way. So they had a special electoral commission selected to choose the president. And on this commission, there were 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. So you can guess who they're going to vote for. 8 Republicans will vote for the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, and 7 Democrats would vote for the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Now, the Democrats are furious. They threatened to boycott the inauguration and create rival governments, recognizing Samuel J. Tilden as the president. And many people in the South and the North, they feared there would be a new civil war. So they made a compromise to avoid further disputes, and that's what is called the Compromise of 1877. Now, the Compromise of 1877, the Democrats conceded. This is the compromise, right? Nobody wanted a war, and the Democrats they decided to concede the election to Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, the Republicans, in return, would take the troops out of the South, and that's basically the end of Reconstruction, because that was the only thing keeping Reconstruction together. So Reconstruction was officially over. Democrats in the South had no fear of troops and could intimidate black voters. And after 1877, Republicans did not have the will to intervene in the South. And segregation would begin in the South, the Jim Crow laws, and would last into the 1900s. And it would not be until the 1950s that the civil rights movement would begin. All right, I hope you learned something today about Reconstruction. If you have any questions, please write your questions in the comments and I can answer them. Or if I made any mistakes in this presentation, please let me know. And also, don't forget to check out my store. I'd really appreciate it. It's for teachers. And also hit the thumbs up button for me and subscribe and share this video. All right. Thank you so much.